The one thing you do always need on a Monday is something to give you a little bit of a chuckle. Probably for the wrong reasons. Rancid Paul is somebody who, whenever he opens his orifice, you just think, is this guy for real? He's had a normal one. Well, most of us would say this is somebody who's heading for a straightforward frontal lobotomy. In Rand Paul's world, it's Monday morning.
Open the champagne, pop the cork. The Senate Democrat leader and the Republican leader are on their way to Kiev. They've got $60 billion they're bringing. I don't know if it'll be cash in pallets, but they're taking your money to Kiev. Now, they didn't have much time, really no time and no money to do anything about our border. We're being invaded. A literal invasion's coming across our border. 800,000 people came illegally in the last month, and all they had time to do in the Senate was get the money, get the cash pallets, load the planes, get the champagne ready, and fly to Kiev. On Friday, they will take the $60 billion to Kiev, crack the champagne, and meanwhile, each day, between 5,000 to 10,000 people come across the border illegally. Now, they put up a sham bill, and they said, you should have taken the sham bill. You should have taken the ruse. We gave you a border bill. But the border bill would allow 5,000 people a day to come across, and then they would declare an emergency. Guess what? The emergency's already here. 700,000 people in 2 months is an emergency. Nearly 800,000 people in 2 months is an emergency. But they gave lie to the ruse when they tweeted out their great bullet points on how great this deal was going to be. They tweeted out, the border never closes. So they were putting forward this great border bill that the president would use to stop illegal immigration, but they tweeted out of all the main points that this would do, that the border never closes. And this is actually true, because what would happen is they would close the illegal crossings, but leave the legal crossings open. It's like, why wouldn't we have the illegal crossing always closed? Why wouldn't we, after having 750,000 people come in illegally, close down the illegal crossings immediately? And what also gives lie to their assertions is that we have the same laws we had under President Trump. And President Trump controlled the border. So how could President Trump do it with the same set of laws? And now they say, if you only gave us power, we would do something. But what gives lie to this assertion is that they're in court every day trying to dismantle the barriers that Texas puts up. Texas and 30-some-odd Republican governors have said enough's enough. They put cargo containers and razor wire on the border to say no more illegal crossings. So the Biden administration, who says just give us more power and we'll do something about the border, went all the way to the Supreme Court to get the power, and they have it temporarily. They may not keep it, but they have fought tooth and nail to remove the cargo containers, remove the razor wire, remove the border barriers. So which is it? They want more power to shut down the illegal immigration, or they want to remove the border obstacles to illegal immigration. I can't have it both ways. Now, some would argue, well, this appears to be that you don't want immigrants in your country. Nothing could be further from the truth. We admit 1 million immigrants to our country every year, and I'm for that. In fact, I'm co-sponsor of a half a dozen bills to increase lawful immigration. I think it would be difficult for America to do a lot of things, including building houses, apartments, and commercial construction, without new people coming to the country. I think some of the best Americans just got here. Many of them are my friends. Bowling Green, Kentucky is known for people from all over the world. We have 100 languages being spoken in our schools. This has nothing to do with not wanting immigrants. It has to do with not wanting 750,000 people to come across who we don't know who they are. Most of them are males of a military age, and we're doing nothing. So we come to an inflection point. That's where we are, an inflection point. And we had a chance. 41 of us, 41 Republicans could have stood and said, no, we want something better. There's an emergency on the border, and we will not settle for anything until we get a border security bill. Instead, it folded. Why? Because Republican leadership is flying with the Democrat leadership to Kiev because they have prioritized Ukraine over the southern border. There's no other way to put it. We have a disaster at our southern border, and the ranking Republicans and the ranking Democrats, there is no difference. They're on the same team. They'll be on the same plane to Kiev. Republicans and Democrats, same plane, pallets of cash, your money to Ukraine. Even if you could make the argument, and I think there is an argument that there is a noble cause, that these people are fighting for their independence and they're fighting against aggression. All of that is true, but there is no money to give them. We're out. We are flat out of cash. Not only are we flat out of cash, we're $34 trillion in the hole. We're borrowing money like it's going out of style. We have never, ever borrowed money at this alarming rate. It's hard to even fathom the billions of dollars that goes out the door. It's been said before, but people have asked, how do you imagine, how do you put into perspective $1 billion? What is $1 billion? If you put $1 million in the palm of your hand in $1,000 bills, it would be 4 inches high. But $1 billion is difficult, more difficult to visualize. To put $1 billion into perspective, 1 billion seconds ago, Reagan was starting his second term. 1 billion minutes ago, the Pantheon was being completed in Rome. 1 billion hours ago, we were in the Stone Age, over 100,000 years ago. But $1 billion ago, just a couple of minutes. In the time that I will speak, the government will spend billions upon billions of dollars, virtually $1 billion every 2 minutes. 30-some billion dollars in the space of an hour. It's out of control. If you look at the debt that's being incurred, and people say, what does it matter? You could be like Dick Cheney and some of these Republicans. Deficits don't matter. We don't care about the deficit. Well, you should, and you see the results of the deficit every time you fill up your car. Every time you go to the grocery store, every time you buy something, you're seeing the results of the debt. The way we pay for the debt is we print up money. The Federal Reserve buys the debt, but the Federal Reserve has no money, so they print up the money and they dilute the value of the existing currency. What does that mean? Inflation, prices go up, but so does the cost of government. People have cost of living increases, and I don't begrudge that, but it's 9% in the last year or so. So the costs of Social Security are going through the roof. The cost of Medicare are going to the roof. But do you hear a peep? Not one peep about the problem paying our own bills. We are basically like renters paying for our apartment. In what kind of world do you borrow money to send charity? If you see a homeless person and you want to help them, but you have no money, would you go to the first corner and go into the bank and say, I want to help homeless people. Will you give me $1,000 so I can help homeless people? No one does that. If you're paying the rent for your apartment, do you go to the bank and borrow the rent for your apartment? No, there are times at which you borrow against things of value. You can borrow against a home that you have a down payment on. You can borrow for capital improvements like schools or roads, but you don't borrow for your daily expenses. That's what's going on here. Realize that 2/3 of the spending is entitlements. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and food stamps is 2/3 of all spending. That's all we have enough money for. Tax revenue pays for that. Everything else is borrowed. You'll hear people talk about a budget. They say Congress votes on a budget. Well, the budget we vote on is equal to about $1.5 trillion. That's the debt. Every bit of the budget we vote on is borrowed. Last month, we borrowed $210 billion. So we're on course to borrow over $2 trillion at that rate. People are alarmed by this. The head of the Federal Reserve, Powell, said the other day that the problem was urgent. And these are the kind of people that pick their words carefully. The debt is urgent. The need to restrain spending is urgent. And so how does leadership respond? The Republican leaders and the Democrat leaders have gotten together to send $100 billion to another country while they can't pay the bills for our country. We're borrowing money to pay our rent as citizens in our own country, and we're sending $100 billion to another country. Under what world is that a good idea? It's a terrible idea. The Federal Reserve Chairman has said the problem is urgent. Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, has said the problem is urgent. Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, has said it is urgent. You have all of these people, some who predicted the crisis in 2008, saying it's an imminent crisis. The debt crisis hangs over us. There's a danger of destroying the dollar and destroying our country, and leadership is concerned about making their plane to Kiev. The Republican leader and the Democrat leader will be on a plane to Kiev, I'm assuming with champagne and pallets of cash. Have you ever seen the pictures when they unload the pallets of American cash, when they did it in Iraq? How much oversight do you think there is on pallets of cash? How much is stolen? Well, you'll never know because they have refused to have an inspector general. I've forced at least 2 votes on this. I've been advocating for over a year. I'm not for sending your money to Ukraine. But if you're going to send it, can we at least count how much is being stolen? Ukraine has been on the top 10 list for one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and nobody's watching the money. Now, journalists in Ukraine have actually caught a few people. We haven't caught anybody. If you ask our people from our Defense Department, they'll say, oh, nothing to see here. You realize our Defense Department has never been audited. We've been trying to audit the Pentagon in our country for 2 decades. Do you know what the Pentagon tells Congress? We're too big to be audited. You know what my response is? You're too big then. You should be smaller if you can't even audit the money we're spending. They routinely lose billions of dollars. They routinely have billions of dollars paid. They have no idea where the dollars went. And so in the midst of this, in the midst of a $1.5 trillion deficit this year at least, the leadership has come together. People say they want compromise. Well, you're getting it today, but it's the wrong kind of compromise. It's compromise to loot the Treasury. It's compromise to spend money we don't have. We have not 1 penny saved. There is no savings. There is no rainy day fund. They are shoveling out borrowed cash. Essentially, they have to borrow this from China. They either borrow it from China or they print it up. But there is no money. There's no money sitting around. It's all been spent. There isn't enough money to take care of the stuff they already promised. So everyone on the other aisle and half the people on this side that are wanting to send more cash over there have also promised they're going to take care of you. So all the entitlement programs are out there. Well, the entitlement programs consume all of our tax revenue. There's no money beyond that. So the military and the non-military discretion, that's about 1/3 of the overall spending. There's no money for it. It's all borrowed. So we're going to add to that. Now, I've often asked the question, couldn't we maybe set priorities? And if you really believe that Ukraine is part of our national security, which is ludicrous, but if you believe that, maybe the money should come out of the defense budget. If this is truly, if defending Ukraine is defending our country, which is ludicrous, but if it were, we're at $880 billion in our military budget. This is more than the next 10 countries in NATO combined. If you really want to send your money to Ukraine, take it out of the military budget. Take it out of something. This is a perpetual problem. But I think the American public needs to know, as Republican leaderships and Democrat leaderships jet off to Kiev, cracking the champagne, and delivering pallets of cash, they need to know that there was opposition to this. People say, why do you come to the floor? Why do you make the poor senators be here over the Super Bowl weekend? Why do you make them cancel their vacations? You think I do it just to be mean or out of spite? I do it because I care about our country. I care about the bankrupting of America. I care about the looting of our treasury. There can be an honest debate over national security or what is in our vital security, but there never is a debate. If you look closely at what people say, they'll simply declare it's in our national security to send money to Ukraine. There isn't really a debate. I actually think it's the opposite. I think sending money to Ukraine actually makes our national security more endangered. I think it threatens our vital national security to send more money to Ukraine. Why? Because I think it threatens the fiscal solvency of our country. I think it, along with so much of the rest of the spending, is dragging America down and threatening a day of destruction. There have been civilizations who have destroyed their currency, and typically this happened on the heels of war. After World War I, Germany destroyed their currency. After World War II, England was in arrears to such an extent that they no longer were the dominant currency after World War I and II, and the U.S. became the dominant currency. I think that we should think twice before sending our money overseas. I think we should think twice about the problems we have here at home. But I think the American people ought to look at those here in this body who are willing to prioritize another country over our country. I think they need to look at that and decide, is this what you want? Is this what the American people really want? Did you elect these people to ignore the southern border and to send money to look at Ukraine's border? To prioritize Ukraine's border over the U.S. border, is that what you elected these people to do? And if you did, do you not care about the bankrupting of America? Do you not care about the destruction of the dollar? It's happening every day, and it's happening sort of gradually, 5–10% a year of lost purchasing power. But there are people who are left behind, people whose salaries aren't adjusted with inflation, people who are being squeezed by this inflation. And people say, whose fault was the inflation? Republicans or Democrats? And I say both. Really, there is only one party when you get down to it. They all want to spend money. The leadership in the Republican Party is really not a great deal. And this is a secret you're not supposed to expose in Washington, but there's not a lot of difference between the Democrat leadership and the Republican leadership. They kind of want to spend money sometimes for different things. Sometimes the Republicans want to spend more on the military enterprise, and Democrats maybe more on welfare. But they get together. People say, oh, there's not enough compromise in Washington. There's way too much compromise. Why? They compromise to spend money we don't have. So in order to raise military spending, they got to promise that they'll raise the welfare spending as well. There's one particular argument that's been made by Republican leadership as well as Democrat leadership as well as the White House. I find this argument particularly reprehensible, particularly disgusting and disturbing. They make the argument that it's really not so bad to send money to Ukraine because it increases the profits of the arms merchants. And most of the arms merchants selling the arms into this war are Americans. They say, oh, it's a win-win. We send the money overseas to Ukraine, but Ukraine then buys our arms, and the arms merchants are enriched. I don't know. I know there are no American soldiers yet in this war, but I have some sympathy for the young men and women involved in this war, that the argument that we should perpetuate the war, or that the war isn't a bad thing, and that war is not a hell on earth because we make some profit off of it, I find that disgusting. I find it really disturbing that there are people out there making the argument on both sides of the aisle, no big deal, it's helping our defense industrial base. It's another word for the military-industrial complex, because even Eisenhower warned 70-some years ago, he warned that there was a danger that the military-industrial complex would get so big that it wouldn't be policy led by Congress, that the corporations would become so big, trillion-dollar corporations grabbing up money, that they would direct policy. That it would no longer be you voting or no longer be us voting, but it would be the corporate interests who make the profits would be driving this. And I think we've become eerily close to that. This is sort of the quiet part they used to not say out loud. They used to keep it kind of on the QT. We're just going to not talk about the profits going to the arms merchants, but now they're bragging about it. The defense industrial base. We are going to enhance the defense industrial base. Really? The meat grinder of war is now justified by expanding the profits of arms merchants? Some estimates are 500,000 people have died in that war. So if we keep it going for another year or two, maybe 1 million will be dead in the war. That'll be good for arms profits. So is that what our advocacy is? Not to shorten the war, but it's not so big a deal to let the war go on and on? The head general in Ukraine has said that the war has come to a stalemate. And I'm the first to acknowledge, look, the whole war was started by Russia. Russia's the aggressor. There is nothing good to be said about Putin doing this. He is the aggressor. He is in the wrong. But that doesn't really change the situation on the ground. It's at a standstill. 500,000 people have died. It's at a standstill. Some towns in Ukraine, you can't find young people anymore. They're either dead or have gone off to Europe to avoid the war. So Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, fired his major general because the major general admitted the truth, which is this is at a stalemate. Many people in this body, to justify foreign aid, will say we're spreading and projecting American power and American values. We're trying to teach and show to the world the nobility of democracy. Yeah, if you watch one of the networks, that's all you hear, democracy, democracy, democracy. Well, guess what? Ukraine's not a democracy. They don't have elections. So they've stopped having elections several years ago, and there's no plan to have elections. So Zelensky had one, and I'm not saying he didn't win. In all likelihood, it was a legitimate election. But it's sort of one and done. He's not going to have more elections. And so we are bending over backwards, not we, the Republican leadership and all of the Democrats are bending over backwards to send money to a country that doesn't have elections. This is a country that has banned media criticism. There is no media criticism. And you'd think the defenders of the First Amendment would be irate the fact that there is no objective media criticism in Ukraine. But the reason why the other side is not standing up and why they're not crazy in arms about this is they actually want that now in our country. They actually are for censorship. They believe in the homeland security of the United States censoring and telling people they can't tell you. So if I were to say, which I've said 1 million times, that it's a mistake to vaccinate your kids for COVID, because they already have immunity, and that there are some risks to that vaccine, the other side will say, I don't have the right to say that. They say that it would be okay for government in league with corporations to censor my speech. If I were to tell you masks don't work, and they don't, all of the studies, 78 randomized controlled studies say masks don't work, you can wear one. I'm not going to forbid you from wearing one. I would just tell you the truth. They will say I shouldn't be allowed to say that. I can still say it on the Senate floor. But if I say it on some of the big tech platforms, we have the FBI and Homeland Security under the Biden administration sitting down and meeting with big tech on a weekly basis to encourage them to take down my speech. So when Ukraine limits speech, you don't hear much of a criticism. They just send their money because they are no longer opposed to censorship. They're no longer for the First Amendment. They're for the First Amendment unless you're spreading misinformation. But what is misinformation? It's their definition and their idea that they don't like what you're saying. I would be perfectly willing to acknowledge there are arguments on the other side of what I'm saying, whether masks work, whether you should vaccinate your children. I think the arguments are stronger on our side, and I'll debate anybody on these subjects, and I think they should be debated. And then you should make your own choice. In a free country, you make a choice. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. Vaccinate your kids, don't vaccinate your kids. But to ban the speech is a very dangerous precedent. This is the kind of speech that they're in favor of banning in our country. So they're not too troubled when speech is banned in Ukraine. There's also been banning of religious authorities in Ukraine as well. So we don't have elections in Ukraine, we banned speech, and there's also been a banning of religion as well. And yet the fervor of people to send the money, to load the plane is likely loaded. Now, I may be exaggerating that there are going to be pallets of cash. They're probably going to be a computer entity, but it's much more visual to imagine the pallets of cash. But there will be a plane that will leave this weekend, and it will have the Republican leader on it and the Democrat leader, and they will be celebrating $60 billion of your money going to Ukraine. $60 billion. $60 billion we don't have. And also at the same time, they had no time to discuss the invasion coming in from the southern border. We didn't have 1 minute. We haven't had an amendment. We have several amendments that would actually put border security back into the bill. And some on the other side, I love this. They have said, well, because you oppose the bill, you don't deserve to have amendments. I love the definition and the idea of what their concept of democracy is. If you agree with me, you get to have speech. But if you don't agree with me, you, my goodness, you are a deplorable, and you don't deserve to have your speech or to have amendments. That's what they've said, basically. So right now, there have been no amendments on border security. There is an emergency at the southern border. I'm all for more legal and lawful immigration. I have several bills that would do exactly that. I have bills that would expand employment-based immigration. It used to be when you came to our country, particularly when we had the big waves of people coming in towards the end of the 19th century, you had to have a sponsor and you had to work. I don't have a problem with that. Even some of the people who have already come here and didn't follow the rules, I'd probably be in favor of allowing work permits. But the thing is I'm not in favor of 780,000 people coming en masse across the border. People are coming from China. People are coming from Venezuela and Colombia and Paraguay. They're coming from all over the place. There was a Pew study a few years ago that did samplings of people. Who would come to America if you could? It was estimated that 750 million people would. Do you think we can take 750 million people all at once? You think we can double our population? No, there has to be some planning. There has to be some periodic sort of obstacles. There has to be a lawful way to come into this country. So I've been for expanding the lawful pass. I've been for expanding employment-based immigration. Most of the people I know who are first generation are great workers. Like I say, some of the best Americans just got here. But we can't have a wide open border. We can't allow the invasion to continue. What has transpired here over the last few days and will continue to transpire is basically ignoring the people. There is an elite class in this country that think that Americans aren't smart enough to figure these things out. They think that Americans aren't smart enough to really figure out whether they want to vaccinate their kids, whether they want to wear a mask, or figure out whether or not 6 feet of distance works. Did you hear the one recently when they interviewed Fauci? They asked him where the 6 feet of distance came from. He's like, I don't know. I think we just made that one up. Really? I went to my son's university for graduation. They had white circles drawn on the ground outside. You had to stand in another white circle 6 feet from people outside. There's zero science behind that. Zero. They don't even know where their supposed science came from. I said, I thought you came up with the science. No, I thought you did. I thought it worked. It doesn't work. And you don't catch a disease outside. All of those things. We went through graduations with people with masks on and the chairs 6 feet apart. My favorite is this, though. These people are so obsessed and think masks work that you'll see them on the floor now. And not all of them, I'm just guessing, but I know at least some of them on the floor when they're wearing a mask is because they have COVID. And it's like, they used to teach the common sense when I went to medical school and when I was growing up, you stayed home when you were sick. If you had an infectious disease, you stayed home. Now they tell you to just keep going and confronting people but wearing a mask. That doesn't work. Why don't the masks work? Because the pores in the mask are 600 times bigger than the virus, and the virus is aerosolized. Not just on droplets of water, aerosolized, moving freely throughout the air. Probably the most imbecilic thing we did, which rivals maybe the Middle Ages, is plexiglass. These morons told you that plexiglass would stop the virus. Only a moron would say that. There's no truth to that. There's no science to that. It's ridiculous. It should be a Saturday Night Live skit. Plexiglass that's this high, the virus can't go over it, the virus can't go around it. A group of engineers at MIT looked at this and looked at patterns of flow, and I can't say that I know that this is right or not, but they conjectured actually that the plexiglass actually made it worse because the lamellar flow of air was actually disrupted by these things, and your filtration systems, which actually probably do serve some value, were interrupted by the plexiglass. But that's what we live through. But these are the people who inflicted these things on you believe that you're not smart enough to make your own decisions. When you tell people at home what's going on up here, and I go home every weekend, go to the grocery store, go to church. When I tell people at home that they just sent $60 billion overseas, they're aghast. They say, how can that happen? They say they know of no one. If I'm in Eastern Kentucky, I could be talking to a fireman, a policeman, city councilman. They come up to me spontaneously and say, we have problems here in our country. We can't pay for the basic functioning of our country. Only 2/3 of the spending in Washington is paid for. An entire third of it is borrowed. And yet they want to send money to a foreign country to deal with their problems? Shouldn't we try to take care of our own country first? Shouldn't we try to do something to actually, quit the destruction of our own currency? How do they get away with it? It's incredibly unpopular. If you were to take this position in my state and ask everybody in Kentucky, how many of you think that we should send $100 billion overseas and do zero for the southern border? Not a penny, not one policy change, nothing for the southern border. How many people believe that? In my state, it's close to zero. Very few people believe that. So how does it happen up here? It happens because there's not enough sunlight. There's not enough transparency. So that's part of what a filibuster is. This is a talking filibuster today. And the reason we talk is to try to broadcast this message, to get the message home so they can send us better people. Madam President, can you tell me how much time I have remaining in the hour of speaking?
The senator has 27 minutes remaining.
All right. So one of the proposals that I've had, I think is a modest proposal, and you would think would be a no-brainer and should have been adopted unanimously, and that's to have an inspector general oversee the money. We've been doing this in Afghanistan for 20 years. Now, we still spent nearly $2 trillion in Afghanistan over 20 years, but at least there was someone trying to watch. Because in times of war, a lot of things happen. They talk about the fog of war. Sometimes there's atrocities, sometimes there's killing of civilians, almost always, but there's also a lot of stealing. There's, they have a name for it. It used to have a bad connotation, war profiteer. But it happens. In Afghanistan, there was a hotel being built. It was being built across the street from our embassy. It was framed out. It was halfway, it was at least started. You could tell it was going to be a hotel. And as it was being built, somebody said, wow, it looks like they'll look right down into the courtyard of our embassy. And somebody said, wow, wouldn't that be a safety risk? And other people said, yeah, I think you're right. And so the construction slowed down when they evaluated the possible safety risks of building a tall hotel looking down on our embassy. Meanwhile, the guy who had the money fled to Jordan with $60 million. I think it was going to cost $80 million. They put about $20 million into it, and it was left there as an eyesore. And my understanding, it was eventually torn down. How did we know about this? Because we had an inspector general. the Inspector General. It's called a SIGAR, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. So I had a proposal over a year ago. I said, why don't we take the Inspector General, who's been doing this in Afghanistan, already has a budget, because I just happen to be conservative with everything. And I said, we don't even need a new budget. The guy's already got a budget. He's got $10 or $15 million in his budget. Why don't we switch him over from Afghanistan to Ukraine? I've told absolutely everyone I know about it. When I go home, I mention it. People mention it to me. I've not heard of one person who's opposed to it. I've not heard of one person who would be opposed to having an Inspector General. So we voted on it. The other side almost universally voted it down, and some on my side voted against it. Why? Because the Inspector General has a history of finding waste. They don't like him. I picked him because he apparently is good at his job. He has a whole series of maybe 50 to 100 economists, accountants, people who are used to looking at war spending, and he finds the people wasting it. He writes a book on it every year. One of the waste projects that he found was a natural gas station. And this is the kind of ludicrous stuff that people at home don't know about, and this is stuff the other side sticks in everything. Everything's got to be green. We're going to make the military green. So they decided they wanted to have a natural gas station in Afghanistan. You have to realize this is a country where a lot of the food is still cooked on open fires and people ride burros, not natural gas cars. But they built it. They spent $45 million building a natural gas station 30, 40 miles out from any military site. Couldn't be protected. But then they discovered another problem, and I guess maybe they hadn't thought this through. They wanted to go green, and they wanted to get rid of the internal combustion. They wanted to go to natural gas and away from gasoline. They were going to solve climate change in Afghanistan, a country of open fires. So they built this natural gas station for $45 million, but lo and behold, you know what they discovered? Nobody had a car that ran on natural gas. So, never to be deterred, the wastrels of American spending said, let's buy them cars that go on natural gas. We got a gas station. We got to get them cars that run on natural gas so we can cure global warming in Afghanistan. So they bought them, I think, 24 cars that ran on natural gas, but they didn't think this one through either. The people now had a gas station that delivered natural gas to their cars. We gave them a couple of cars that ran on natural gas, but they didn't have any money. So we said, let's get them a credit card. So they got them credit cards to buy the natural gas. We have a gas station, natural gas cars, but now here's your credit card. They didn't think that all the way through either. It turns out that people were still killing each other in that part of the world, and it was too dangerous for our soldiers to protect. So when one of my staff members asked to see the natural gas station, he was told by our soldiers, too dangerous to see it. So as you can imagine, this natural gas station now looks like, if you can imagine an inner city gas station with the copper pipes torn out, you know, anything that's of value torn out of the ground, that's your natural gas station in Afghanistan. That's your $45 million, and that's war. Even with an Inspector General, we found out about it. Can you imagine what war is like with no Inspector General? Now, the other side will say, oh, the Department of Defense has an Inspector General. Well, yeah, they do. This is the Department of Defense that's missing a couple $1 trillion worth of equipment. This is the Department of Defense that says they're too big to be audited. So I would say that we have to be a little bit wary of just saying, oh, the Department of Defense will watch this money. So I mentioned earlier about $1 billion. You know, what is $1 billion? So $1 million in the palm of your hand is $1,000 bills. If you have $1,000 bills, it would be 4 inches high, would be $1 million. $1 billion is more difficult to visualize. But to put $1 billion into perspective, 1 billion seconds ago, Reagan was starting his second term. 1 billion minutes ago, the Pantheon was being completed in Rome. 1 billion hours ago was the Stone Age, over 100,000 years ago. But $1 billion ago, at the rate we're spending money, just a little more than 2 minutes ago. Now that's $1 billion. See, you wonder how bad things are around here. We used to think $1 billion was a lot of time, a lot of money. But now we have trillion. We have trillion of $34 trillion. I remember when George W. Bush was president, it was $5 trillion, and it went to $10 trillion. I was like, gosh, this is terrible. This is a Republican administration. Then when Obama was president, it went from 10 to 20. Then when Trump was, it went up 7.5, 8 in 4 years, even at a more alarming rate. Each president's been worse. They've all been bad. Well, Congress deserves some of the blame, too. It doesn't happen without Congress, but the money's going crazy. But we're up to about $1.5 trillion. So I looked this up this morning. I wanted to know if you stacked $1 bills and you wanted to know how big 1.5 trillion is. Well, if you take 2 years worth of debt, that's $3 trillion, and you want it in $1 bills, the $1 bills would stack all the way to the moon, over 230,000 miles away. We're starting to talk about a bit of money here. But it's not just the overall debt. When they pay for the debt, the Federal Reserve dilutes the currency, and the currency becomes worth less and less. But also what happens is our interest rates increase over time. So under George W. Bush, we went from 5 to 10 trillion, and we doubled the debt from 5 to 10 trillion. In that period of time, the interest rate was cut in half, so interest rate really wasn't a lot worse. But we finally, I believe, have lost the ability for the Federal Reserve to suppress interest rates. Interest rates have risen, and interest payments have doubled. We're on course within the next year or so to have interest rates become the largest item, pushing out and crowding out other spending in the budget. Mark my words, this $100 billion will add to that problem, and I think is absolutely an utter mistake and insult to every American that we ignore the invasion at our southern border in order to send money overseas. I reserve the balance.